Hello and welcome to this ISM webinar, Supporting Safer Practices Safeguarding Essentials with the ISM. I'm Ella Doyle, Events Coordinator and Communications Officer at the ISM, and to describe myself for the purpose of accessibility, I'm a white woman with brown hair wearing a blue top and the ISM logo is behind me. The ISM is the UK's professional body for musicians, and our members come from all areas of the industry, from a wide variety of genres and musical backgrounds. This includes those who are studying and starting out to those with established careers in the industry. If you aren't already a member, you can find out more about joining the ISM via our website, and there should be a link in the chat. I am delighted today to be joined by Nerys Owen, Senior Legal Advisor at the ISM, and Jonathan Storey, barrister specialising in the fields of professional regulation, education and sports law. Before we begin the webinar, there's just a few things to note. Please do introduce yourselves and chat to your fellow attendees in the chat box below. And during the webinar, please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function, and we'll do our best to answer these at the end, but we've also had some pre-submitted questions for that. This webinar is not a substitute for an accredited safeguarding and education course, and unfortunately, we can't provide any certification for attending. If you experience any technical difficulties, let us know in the chat box and we'll attempt to resolve these. And if you wish to use them, subtitles are available to enable at the bottom of your screen. This webinar is being recorded and we will share the recording with you afterwards. Now, I'm very pleased to hand over to Jonathan, who'll be sharing some practical guidance for safeguarding. Thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ella. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be invited to contribute to this webinar, and it's a particular delight to find myself among such a large group of musicians. I thought it might be helpful if I just tell you a little bit about me before I start, not because it's particularly interesting or because I want to blow my own rusty trumpet, but because it might help you to understand where I come from in the guidance I'm going to provide. As Ella says, I'm a barrister now, and I specialise in professional regulation, education and safeguarding. About half of my time is spent working for the main teaching unions, supporting and representing their members who are in difficulty for disciplinary reasons, and in most cases facing a professional conduct panel hearing, which could result in them being banned from teaching. My wife's a teacher, as it happens, too, and it sometimes causes her some amusement when people ask if that's how we met. Anyway, in addition to my work defending teachers, I also chair Fitness to Practice hearings involving doctors and nurses, and I'm involved in police misconduct tribunals as well. And that's now, but my first love was and remains music, and I was very fortunate to spend all my secondary education as an oboist at Chetham's in Manchester, and not a very good one, I have to say, but then playing huge amounts of music at university in Oxford. Given the different strands of my background, I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to work on a number of occasions with musicians who've been investigated for misconduct in the course of their teaching work, usually peripatetic teachers going into schools for just a few hours each week, alongside freelance performing and private teaching at home. In each of the cases I've done where I've worked with a musician accused of misconduct, they had no idea they were regulated as teachers. Indeed, in most cases, they didn't even see themselves primarily as a teacher. They hadn't been trained as a teacher. They didn't attend teachers' CPD at the schools they worked at, and they didn't appreciate their responsibilities as teachers. But really, the difficulties faced by visiting or peripatetic music teachers are many. As wonderful as the job is, it is a difficult position. Not only do visiting music teachers not often identify primarily as teachers, not only are they not usually trained as teachers, not only is their status quite precarious if they're self-employed, but music is quite distinctive as a subject in any event. It's a creative subject, of course, characterized by close and informal relationships between pupils and teachers. It's a subject in which the pupil and the teacher often has to be vulnerable and emotionally open. It's a subject in which the pupil and the teacher are more personally invested than, say, in maths or even sport. It's a subject often taught one-to-one. behind closed doors. It's a subject with an element of demonstration, or at the very least requiring the teacher to sit or stand in close proximity to the pupil. As one flute teacher, my daughter's actually, wrote to me recently in an email, music touches the soul and the boundaries can become quite blurred. In my view, all those difficulties, those unusual features, unique features really of music, account for most of the reasons why my clients, my musician clients, have ended up under investigation for misconduct. And that's why I've been keen over the last few years to speak at events such as this, to assist musicians in understanding their responsibilities when teaching, and to share ideas, tips, and advice on their professional conduct, on professional boundaries, and on safeguarding, with a view to helping musicians protect themselves and, of course, helping them to protect those who they teach. Now, I think it's important that I'm clear at the outset what this session is not going to involve, at least on my part. It's not accredited safeguarding training. It's not going to be focused on any particular case. And I'm not going to spend much or any time advising on behaviours that everyone knows are wrong, and I'm sure none of you would ever consider. What I am going to do, with a particular focus on those who teach in schools for at least part of the time, is look at some of the grey areas, the behaviours that often aren't contained explicitly in any guidance or codes of conduct, and the issues that even great teachers, excellent musicians, struggle with. And I've represented some really outstanding musicians and teachers who, for various reasons, have come under suspicion for misconduct. My aim in the time I have, which is about half an hour, isn't to give all the advice I could possibly give, but rather to flag the most common areas of concern and offer some ideas for how you might think about navigating them. I want to look at, in particular, music teachers' relationships with pupils, some of the issues that arise from teaching one-to-one, communicating with pupils, touching pupils, getting the best out of pupils, safeguarding pupils. And if I've got time, I want to touch briefly on the issues of social media and the regulatory expectations on teachers in relation to their private lives. Now, necessarily, that's going to be a whistle-stop tour, but I hope it's one that opens your eyes to potential issues rather than just disorientating you completely. And that's my hope anyway. I want to start with 3 guiding principles, which I think if more musicians had in their mind and understood, would lead to a lot of problems actually being avoided. And the first is that if you're teaching music, if you're teaching an instrument, if you're teaching a pupil, you are a teacher with all the responsibilities that that involves. You're not a friend, you're not a coach, you're not a guide, you're not a pedagogue. You're not there just to encourage or inspire or facilitate. You're a teacher. And that means that you have certain responsibilities, and it also means that you and your pupil should be clear about those responsibilities, clear about where they start and where they end. That's my first guiding principle. You're a teacher. Be clear about your role. My daughter's flute teacher summed it up this way. Pupil instrumental teacher interaction might represent one of the longest standing relationships in a pupil's school career. Therefore, one must be very careful and do one's best to keep as professional as possible, not becoming over-familiar, whilst at the same time responding with sensitivity to a pupil's needs, a delicate balance. So you're a teacher. My second guiding principle is that your primary role as a teacher isn't to help your pupil improve on the violin or identify their hidden potential or realize their potential or cajole them to practice or get them to grade 8 or whatever it is. Your primary role as a teacher, the primary role of all teachers, is to safeguard your pupils. That trumps all else. You may well want your pupils to improve. That's obviously important. You may well want them to be happy and enjoy their lessons. You might want to help realise your pupils' potential, to help them to get to grade 8 or whatever it might be. All of those objectives are fine, but your main role is to keep them safe. And my third guiding principle is that it's important to remember that if they're under 18 or at school age, your pupil is a child, however good they are. Even if they're 17, they're not a young professional musician, even if they're outstanding. They're not a prodigy, they're not a conservatoire student, they're a child. Now, the most common sort of misconduct referred to the regulator of teaching in England, the Teaching Regulation Agency, and its equivalent in Wales. And to be honest, the main sort of misconduct I encounter with music teachers relates to their relationships with pupils. It is sadly more common than you would imagine or hope for teachers to engage in sexual relationships with their pupils. Now, of course, most of us will probably instinctively think, well, how can anyone be so stupid? It is, of course, a criminal offence for a teacher to have any sort of sexual contact with a pupil. Most people know that. There's almost no legislating for that sort of behaviour. No amount of training is going to stop it. But there are two slightly less severe forms of misconduct that occur very regularly, including in otherwise good schools and involving otherwise good teachers. One of them is the teacher-pupil relationship that starts soon after the pupil stops being a pupil. I've done a few cases of that nature. One of them was a case in which a head teacher who taught a single A-level class became very close to a pupil while he taught her, and then started a relationship with her the following academic year after she'd left. Another one involved a male teacher commencing a sexual relationship with a pupil who just left the school whilst on a summer trip, which she was attending as a helper, as a volunteer. Now, in both of those cases, the teachers claimed that at the time they thought they were doing nothing wrong. The second teacher even said he deliberately avoided anything whilst the pupil was a pupil, knowing that that would be wrong. Unfortunately, for them both, the regulator doesn't share their view. In one recent case, the panel said this. In the panel's view, it was not appropriate for a teacher to embark on a relationship with a former pupil for whom that teacher had admitted to having feelings so soon after that pupil had left. That would suggest that it was acceptable for teachers to wait until pupils finish to engage in romantic or sexual relations. The panel was very clear in its finding that it's not professionally acceptable for a teacher to enter into a romantic or sexual relationship with their former pupil shortly after that pupil had left school or college. Well, how shortly is too soon? In that case, it was months, but I've seen cases in which teachers have been criticised for commencing a relationship of that nature up to a year or more after the pupil stopped being a pupil. In another case, not one of mine, a male teacher formed a relationship with a pupil a few weeks after she left school. And the panel said this. In respect of the teacher's relationship with the pupil, the panel considered that this was born out of a position of trust that the teacher was in as a teacher in the pupil's school, despite her having very recently left. The panel considered that the expectation of the obligations upon the teacher would not have changed overnight, since the relationship originated from a situation where the teacher was in a position of trust. The panel considered this to be inappropriate, and that teacher was prohibited from teaching for life, despite no hint or suspicion of anything inappropriate whilst the pupil was at school. Now, the teacher's standards, which is the government published document, not a particularly great document, I have to say, but it's the guiding standards for teachers. They don't say that what he did is prohibited. And actually, most school codes of conduct don't either, although some do, and others attempt to minimize the risk by prohibiting social media contact with ex-pupils for a particular length of time. The General Teaching Council of Scotland has a code of conduct, which is slightly better, I think. It says, helpfully, in relation to teacher-pupil boundaries, be mindful that professional boundaries can be perceived to extend beyond the pupil's educational establishment leaving date. Therefore, in situations of this nature, you should exercise great care and professional judgment, taking into account all the factors involved. So the boundaries extend beyond when the pupil leaves, but it doesn't say when those boundaries stop. And that's, I guess, because every case turns on its facts. And I guess because if the relationship is born out of one of trust between teacher and pupil, even if a year or more has elapsed, it can be potentially exploitative. And it's also important to say that professional boundaries can extend to pupils at other schools, even if the pupil is over 16, especially if the pupil knows that the teacher is a teacher. I've seen a few cases of teachers hooking up with 17-year-olds, for example, on a night out in circumstances where the pupil, the 17-year-old, knows that the adult is a teacher, and that can be criticised as well. Now, one other aspect, I've spoken about sexual relationships, which are a very discrete category, but one other aspect of teachers' relationships with pupils that I want to touch on is boundaries generally. How do you relate to pupils? How do you talk to them? How do you interact with them? It's important to remember that your relationship with a pupil should be boundaried. That doesn't mean distant or unfriendly or formal, but it does mean, in a sense, distinct. You're the pupil, you're the teacher, they're the pupil. I've known a number of cases involving teachers becoming very friendly with their pupils. In some cases, that friendliness leads to making inappropriate comments to them. In some cases, I've known a number of cases of sexualized jokes with pupils. I had a young client once who made a whole number of sexual jokes to a class of year 11s, which he saw as banter. I mean, in fairness, I think he was trying to build some rapport with them because he didn't have the skills to do so by other means. Unfortunately, the panel considered those jokes to be misconduct, and the jokes themselves were so eye-poppingly crude that it remains my one and only appearance in the Daily Star. Remember, you're the teacher. Sometimes, especially with music teachers one-to-one, the problem with maintaining boundaries is becoming overly personally involved in a pupil's personal affairs, discussing their relationships, maybe even their home life, offering advice in a way that blurs the boundary and perhaps leads pupils to see the teacher as more than a teacher can ever or should ever be. I was very fortunate as a child to have a number of wonderful music teachers, including at Chetham's, who cared about me personally and would talk to me and understand me, who tried to build my confidence, and who showed a keen interest in my holistic development as a musician and as a person. And that's vital, of course, but it can be a slippery slope if a teacher ends up becoming counsellor, friend, quasi-parent. I know a number of young people who stayed in Manchester when they were 18 after leaving Chetham's in order to keep having lessons with the same teacher. Now, that might be fine, especially if there's a particular pedagogical reason for it or a particular pedagogical alignment, but it might be a worrying sign if your pupils seem to be over-attached to you or over-dependent on you. Now, I've spoken about pupils oversharing their lives with teachers. Sometimes boundaries are breached by teachers oversharing their own lives or medical issues or relationships. Again, this can be a slippery slope. If you're working with a pupil one-to-one, you may well be understandably close and friendly with them. They may know that you have a husband or a boyfriend or a girlfriend or children or whatever it might be. There's nothing wrong with that, but where there's a sense of favoritism or over-attachment or expectations of secrecy or expectations of particular loyalty, um, there can be real issues here with boundaries. I've known teachers using forms of emotional control to demand particular loyalty or favors from pupils, or to motivate pupils to put in extra practice. Remember, you're just a teacher. Uh, I ought to just touch on compliments. It's important to be careful, I think, about compliments, especially if they might be misinterpreted. I mean, complimenting a pupil on their shoes or their bag or their pencil case or their effort or their performance of a particular study or whatever it might be is all obviously fine. But complimenting a pupil on their physique, complimenting a pupil if they've lost weight, complimenting a people on their general looks can be dangerous. Uh, Certainly be very careful about saying anything that might be construed as suggestive or flirtatious. Good rule of thumb is always to think how it would look in writing a few years down the line. Um, I've spoken a bit about over attachment. Generally, it may be a concerning sign if you sense your pupil is putting preeminent emphasis on what you say. Um, that might be quite flattering, of course, but it's not healthy. And it's important to remember again that you don't see the whole picture. I don't mean to say this disparagingly, but it's important to remember you are just a teacher, probably just one of many. This was a particular issue, I think, in the specialist music environment that I grew up in, with individual instrumental teachers being seen as almost gurus, whose advice trumped everything else. It's potentially quite risky, and so I think the best way to mitigate the issues of that are to be alert to the signs of over attachment and be careful about the way in which you offer advice. Um, I said at the start that I wanted to touch on the particular challenges that arise from one-to-one teaching. In fact, most of the good advice I could give on that will be covered by Nerys in a bit. So um, I'm not going to go into masses of detail about that, but I do think um, the key principles in any setting are: don't shut yourself away unless it's inevitable, and where it is, many schools have cameras in teaching rooms. Um, Stay in sight through a window or whatever. Keep the door open if that's possible. Stick to normal working hours where possible, especially if you're teaching in a school. I've seen music teachers sometimes come in after a rehearsal or something to give a pupil a special lesson at 10 o'clock. That's a really bad idea, I think. Um, if you're teaching primarily in a school, be wary about offering lessons during holidays. Um, Follow your school policy. If you do end up offering lessons during holidays, make sure you discuss it with your head of music, get written permission, do it at school if possible, and avoid, if you're a school-based teacher, having pupils coming to your house. Um, I want to touch next on communicating with pupils. Sorry for the pace of this, the whistle-stop tour, but I'm in communicating in writing. This is a really common area of risk. Uh, Generally speaking, the best advice is not to communicate in writing directly with a child pupil at all. It's best to communicate via parents if you're teaching privately, and if you're teaching in a school, frankly, via parents or via school staff. Um, it's certainly my advice not to use text messages or social media to contact a current pupil. And if a current pupil adds you as a friend on social media, then my advice is not to accept it. If you're teaching in a school environment and the school does allow written contact directly with pupils, such as via email or Microsoft Teams, follow the school procedures. Don't use personal email if you have a school email account. If you're using Teams or some other messaging platform, remember to keep the boundaries in place. Problems can often arise with messaging. Um, not because the method of communication is itself inappropriate, but because the content or the volume or the timing is. I had a case in which a music teacher repeatedly told a pupil by school email that he was a top student, top man, one of his favourites, his golden boy. Um, it can be quite easy if your Teams messages come through to your phone to lapse into the informality of social media habits when contacting people's. Be wary about that. Um, Avoid contacting people's late at night. Avoid getting into conversation by message. An oboist friend of mine said this to me recently. I've found students often use school email or Teams chat to communicate out of hours and late in the evening. I will always endeavour to answer a pupil if their query is urgent, but try to reply during work hours to maintain a work-life balance and avoid real-time conversations unfolding late in the evening that don't feel appropriate for professional boundaries. I think that's good advice. If a pupil does contact you inappropriately or in unwisely friendly terms, then report it quickly to prevent matters from escalating. And trust the school process to deal with matters appropriately. It may well be that they don't need to speak to the pupil, but it's important they're aware of it. And as for social media contact, I do think it's probably wise not to accept any from former pupils for at least a couple of years after you've stopped teaching them, even if they're 18 and heading off to music college or whatever. Just a few words, I think, on physical contact with pupils. Another very common issue, of course. Generally speaking, the key point is that any physical contact must be necessary and it must be consented to. Physical contact for the purposes of showing affection, however innocent, is rarely necessary. And so a hug is usually to be avoided, even if the pupil's upset, even if it's to say, well done for passing an exam. Remember you're a teacher. Remember how it might look. Physical contact for the purposes of discipline will rarely arise in a music setting. I suppose it's also never necessary. The only context in which physical contact with a pupil might be necessary in that sort of context, I suppose, might be to break up a fight or something. But that hopefully won't be something you'll ever see. And there is specific DfE guidance on that. I think the main potential for physical contact with a music pupil is when demonstrating some aspect of technique. Now, practice varies in this area, I realise, but it's important, I think, to remember that physical demonstration can make students feel uncomfortable. It can leave teachers open to accusations of inappropriate behaviour, even unfair ones. Remember the principles of necessity and consent. It's rarely, I think, necessary to touch a pupil in order to demonstrate something. There's almost always a better way, whether it's modelling on your own instrument or theirs, or using words, or getting the pupils themselves to work it out. Be creative. If you're absolutely certain that it is necessary to touch a pupil, then permission should always be sought and an explanation given. Any physical touch should be purposeful. You should withdraw from the student's personal space immediately afterwards. You should avoid touching the trunk of a pupil's body in any circumstances, and you should be attentive, I think, to the non-verbal language of the student, which might suggest they're uncomfortable, even if they've given permission. I've also had a number of cases where physical contact as such wasn't alleged, but sitting uncomfortably, unnecessarily close was. Remember you're a teacher, remember your boundaries. Before I finish, I just want to cover a few more areas in brief, mainly just to flag them, really. Getting the best out of pupils first. How do we do that? Well, the teacher standards talk about the importance of treating pupils with dignity, building relationships rooted in mutual respect. One way in which a teacher can violate the dignity of a pupil is through the use of harsh language. I had a client some years ago who used to regularly refer to his pupils as little dunces, little idiots. He said it was all very light-hearted. They knew it was a joke. There was never any malice. Um, but my advice was that um, it did put at risk relationships rooted in mutual respect. Teachers occupy a uniquely influential role in children's lives, and so need to be careful to ensure that they're modeling respectful behaviour. Um, that also means never shouting unless it's necessary. And in my view, shouting is only really necessary to warn someone uh, of something urgent or to get their attention. Um, I mentioned in the context of teacher-pupil relationships the dangers of the little tribe and the dangers of um, over-attachment, exerting inappropriate emotional control over pupils, um, demanding loyalty to you, the string quartet coach, or you, the piano teacher, in preference to a pupil's other commitments. Um, this can be a really difficult area in terms of treating pupils with dignity as well. How do we motivate our pupils? Um, I've frequently seen music teachers motivate by threat. You'll never succeed unless, you'll never get into college unless, you'll never make it unless. Um, I'm sure many of you have an opinion on John Elliott Gardner, who we heard a few years ago had a physical altercation with a singer in France. Many conductors are well known for singling out members of orchestras, rebuking them publicly in order to try and get them to meet their standards. Um, it's pretty questionable among adult professionals, of course, but that sort of behavior is never acceptable with children. However brilliant the teacher is, the ends um, and the genius never justify the means, in my view. Um, when it comes to safeguarding pupils, I'm going to leave the process to Nerys, but the key point is, again, you're a teacher, you're not a rescuer, you're not a parent, you're not a friend, you're not a confidant. And that means if a concern comes your way, if a pupil discloses something uh, or is upset about something, listen to them, but without promising confidentiality, reassure them, but not that you'll keep it a secret. Stay calm and report it. It's always safest to report every concern you might have about a child's well-being, however minor. Um, as an instrumental teacher, you might be seeing a pupil once or twice a week, um, quite intensively, and it might be that you notice changes that others don't. You might notice emotional changes, um, physical changes even. For example, loss of weight. Don't take it on yourself to deal with those. You're a teacher, you're not a counsellor or a doctor, you're not a pastoral member of staff, uh, but pass it on. And of course, the fact that you might not, as a VMT, have access to school safeguarding systems, it shouldn't be a barrier to you passing concerns on by other means. I'm just going to close very, very briefly with the question of private life. Teachers are entitled to have private lives, of course, but you should be alert to the potential for your private life, your actions in your private life to bring your professional status as a teacher, even if it's just for a couple of hours a week, into question. And that means, I think, just remembering that you're a teacher when you are in your private life, being careful about what's on social media. I've known numerous music teachers put on social media quite embarrassing comments about their pupils and about their end of term frustrations and knackeredness, whatever it might be. Be careful, especially if your social media account identifies you as a teacher. Remember that you are a teacher, and remember your primary responsibility is to safeguard your pupils. I hope that's not been too disorientating, as opposed to, I suppose, enlightening. It feels a little bit like one of those guided tours that one goes on when you're kind of running after the guide all the time and they're waving some flag and you're kind of losing out of breath. Maybe that's just me being unfit. But I hope it's been helpful. And obviously, if there's some questions after Nerys's contribution, then I'd be happy to answer them. But that's it for me, and I'm sure Nerys will offer you a much more professional and considered perspective on this issue. But thanks for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Now I'm going to pass over to Nerys, as you mentioned, who's going to talk us through the ISM Safeguarding Code of Practice and the Members Code of Conduct. Thanks, Nerys.
That's fine. I'm not going to do that without first saying thank you, though, to Jonathan for such an incredibly useful presentation. Incredibly useful for me, and I'm sure incredibly useful for the members. Absolutely fantastic to have that insight. Thank you so much. So yes, my name is Nerys Owen, and some of you might have come across me because I work as a senior legal advisor in the legal team at the ISM. So my job today is to talk you briefly through the safeguarding code, the ISM safeguarding code and our code of conduct, and the obligations they impose on you as ISM members. So the codes are on the website. I'm also going to say a little bit about what to expect if you're facing a safeguarding concern. How can we help? How can we help you at the ISM? So the ISM has about 11,000 members, as Ella said, and as well as being the UK's professional body for musicians, we're actually a national subject association for the teaching of music in schools. Now, self-evidently, many of our members are in frequent contact with children in their normal working life, whether they're in schools, private teaching, cathedrals, whatever. And that means that the ISM has its own responsibility to promote best practice among our members when it comes to the safeguarding of children. But also, if we have good, clear policies, and that's going to benefit you in turn, because if you follow them, they're going to help to protect you from the kinds of career-threatening allegations we've been hearing from Jonathan, and they can also help you show to your clients that you are a person who takes safeguarding seriously. So as an ISM member, you have to comply with these codes. If you don't comply with the codes, there can be disciplinary consequences. We do have a Child Protection Committee. It is made up of 3 council members. They each have experience in child protection. It's their job to decide how the ISM responds to the most serious child protection allegations, and they will do that following the ISM's disciplinary procedure. So next slide, please. So the next slide, the first slide I'm going to look at then is just to look at what the ISM code says very briefly about DBS checks, what we used to call criminal records checks. It won't be a surprise to anybody to see that we expect all our members who are working with children and vulnerable adults to have an enhanced DBS, or the Scottish or Northern Ireland equivalent if they're going to be working with children or vulnerable adults. So once you've got your certificate, you should consider joining the DBS update service. There's tons of information about this on our website, and the membership team are also really knowledgeable. So if you're in a school or a college, you will already know that the DFE, the Department for Education Statutory Guidance, Keeping Children Safe in Education, updated every year. So it requires all VMTs, like all teachers, whether they're employed or self-employed, to have an enhanced DBS certificate and to do annual safeguarding training. Now, you can't apply for an enhanced DBS check yourself as an individual, but self-employed ISM members can apply for this kind of check via the ISM for a fee. And this obviously also enables you to give parents the kind of peace of mind to know that a check has happened. Again, you can ask membership about this, and they have tons of information. They're very knowledgeable. Any ISM member who wants to be added to the ISM Register of Private Teachers, they must apply for an enhanced DBS certificate through the ISM for self-employed teaching, and you must update it every 3 years unless you're on the update service. So next slide, please. Next thing I'm going to look at then is reporting. What to do if as an ISM member you have a safeguarding concern. Now, all of us, all ISM members, staff, volunteers, we must report safeguarding concerns, as Jonathan just said. So if the concern arises where you work, say in an orchestra or school or music service, then you should raise it with whoever is the designated safeguarding person in that institution. There will be somebody, there'll be a procedure to follow. Now, if you're not sure about how to do this, you can come and ask us and we will help you, okay? If there's another safeguarding concern though that relates to your career as a musician, say for example, in relation to pupils you're teaching privately, then the thing to do is to contact the ISM's designated safeguarding person. You can do it by email, you can do it by phone. The current ISM DSP is called Helen Hurley, and there's an email address on the slide. So Helen will advise you what to do, and if appropriate, she can help you pass the matter on to a local authority designated officer, a LADO. So in a case of serious injury, obviously very unusual, if you were in that situation, you would seek immediate medical attention, and in appropriate cases, you would inform the local authority children's social care department. If it's something out of office hours, or if it's something outside your musical career, we in the legal team, we usually point people in the direction of the NSPCC free 24-hour child protection helpline. There's a number on the slide because they are expert in dealing with all these kinds of issues. There are then, next slide, please. There are some formal reporting obligations you need to know about under the ISM's Code of Conduct that are very relevant in this particular space. So here they are then. As an ISM member, you must notify us promptly if you are subject to an investigation, whether criminal or not, that could raise concerns about the protection of children or vulnerable adults. You must notify us straight away if you're charged, convicted, or cautioned for any criminal offence. And finally, if you're arrested for any offence which, if proved, could cause serious reputational damage to the ISM. So next then, the next 3 slides are going to look at what to do if a safeguarding concern is raised about you as an ISM member and how we can help you. So the very first step is obviously contact the ISM legal team as soon as possible by email. Because you have reported a safeguarding concern, in doing that though, under the code I've just been outlining to you in my earlier slides, this is going to trigger the ISM's internal safeguarding procedures. And that means we will have to notify the ISM's designated safeguarding person under the safeguarding code. So they will then decide whether the matter is serious enough to have to be referred to the Chief Executive Officer, the CEO, and in the most serious cases, on to the ISM's Child Protection Committee. This would all be laid out to you in writing, but it's really important to emphasise to you that only a very small number of the concerns that are raised with the legal team need this kind of referral. I'm going to come on to that in my next slide. So separately to all of that, as long as you remember an ISM member, as long as you remain an ISM member, we in the legal team will carry on doing our very best to support you. I do have to say that our help will be more limited if when you join the ISM, you've already got the problem. But that's just about allocating our resources fairly among the members because we're quite a small team. Now, what should you do in the first instance if you're in this situation as a practical matter? And I always say to members, the first thing you should do is sit down and make a really careful chronological note of everything that's happened. You want your dates, names, exact words, and so on. Start journaling while it's fresh in your mind and keep it updated as you go along. And the reason I say that is because not only is it very easy to forget things, it's really stressful, but this process can drag on for a long, long time. Also remember our 24-hour counselling helpline, which you have as an ISM membership benefit. Don't forget to go to your GP if you need to. You need to look after yourself. So what happens next is going to depend mainly on the nature and seriousness of the allegation. So next slide, please. So this next slide looks at something called low-level concerns. So a low-level concern is keeping children safe in education terminology. It refers to the kinds of inappropriate behaviour that's not serious enough to justify a formal referral to a LADO. In other words, it's not something that suggests a risk of harm to children, but it's something that makes people uneasy. The boundary issues that Jonathan was just discussing, something that causes concern about your behaviour and makes the school worried about whether you understand appropriate professional boundaries. Now, most of the cases that end up in the ISM inbox actually belong in this category. Talking about like casual chat about your personal life, just hearing about inappropriate, stupid jokes, or parent complaints about the way in which you've adjusted posture when playing an instrument. So what's going to happen in this type of situation? So in this kind of case, quite often the school goes to there's a LADO helpline and they get informal advice from the LADO. And the sorts of questions the LADO is going to ask about this are typically, is this the first complaint about you? And they're looking to see if there's a pattern of behaviour, or if you're a person who takes safeguarding seriously. And second, they typically ask, is your safeguarding training up to date? And that's a really good reason, if you needed one, to make sure you do keep it up to date each year. Because again, they want to see that you're someone who takes safeguarding seriously. So typically, there's going to be an internal meeting with HR, with the designated safeguarding person or the head. And then what's the outcome going to be? Well, obviously, the best outcome is no action needed. And in that case, hopefully, they all get some support from the director of music to resolve issues with the parent, to get things back on an even footing, through to perhaps an informal warning or maybe some management guidance, because maybe there actually is something wrong with the way in which you're behaving. Maybe there is an issue with your boundaries that you need to address, perhaps some extra training, sometimes extra training in behaviour management, for example. Right through to formal disciplinary action, or if you are self-employed, obviously you are in a far more vulnerable position and you can end up losing your work. Now, low-level concerns, there's always a written record made and it's kept on file. There's often a wider learning issue too, and what I mean by that is that the school might need to consider policies and improvements in relation to how they're managing safeguarding and training going forward, so that what has gone wrong is learnt from and doesn't happen again, and other staff are protected. But what about a more serious safeguarding concern then? If you're facing a more serious allegation, and what I mean here is anything that suggests a risk of harm to a child, anything sexual or accused of hitting a child, for example, anything to suggest that you're not a suitable adult to work with children, say an allegation of sexual harassment of another teacher, say. Well, obviously, every case depends on its own facts, but in our experience, all these cases have a few things in common. They take a very, very long time, they're incredibly stressful, and communication is usually exceptionally poor. Lots of different agencies are involved. Now, the school is going to formally refer the case to the LADO if the allegation crosses what they describe as the harm threshold, that is to say, risk of harm to a child, and then they're going to follow the LADO's directions, but you're not going to see any of the communications between the LADO and the school. You'll almost certainly be suspended from your work, so you're going to be paid if you're employed, but obviously if you're self-employed, you will not be getting paid over this period. There's an additional complication nearly always for our VMT members, which is that they're likely to be working across several different schools, and so this incident is going to have a knock-on effect on all your other work. This is something you will need support with, and we can help you with that. There may well be police involvement, and it's important to remember that your ISM membership comes with legal expenses insurance for criminal or solicitor who can represent you in a police interview as long as the allegation rises from your work as a music professional while an ISM member. So then once the police are involved, it's very likely there's going to be quite a hefty delay, which is, again, incredibly stressful until they finish their investigation. So let's say they get to the end of their investigation. Hopefully they decide no further action. That's not the end of it. Then the LADO is going to advise the school to do its own internal safeguarding investigation, and they will do that following the school's disciplinary procedures. Now, if the allegations are upheld, obviously there are likely to be disciplinary consequences. They can be dismissal or loss of self-employed work. But the thing about safeguarding is that it's going to go beyond this job, because if a safeguarding allegation is substantiated, that is to say, if there is a finding by the school of a risk of harm to children, then the school must refer you to the Disclosure and Barring Service to decide if you should be barred from teaching children or vulnerable adults. That's to say, even if you resign during the process. There's also, as Jonathan was saying, the potential for referral to the Teaching Regulation Agency to decide if you should be barred from teaching in schools. And lastly, there is the potential for information to be added to your enhanced DBS certificate. You usually get a chance to make representations if this happens to you. And again, this is an area where we may well be able to assist. Now, my next few slides, I've got 3 more slides. I'm not sure how the time is going. I'm going to race through them really quickly because the truth is that not only has Jonathan covered most of this, but also these have come largely from our own code of conduct. And so you can read them, basically. You can find them on the website. So it's guidance for private teachers teaching at home. So it's all the same as Jonathan's just said about communication. I'm looking through the slide, I can't see anything that is new, and he explained it so well. So I'm going to skip through that one onto the next slide. Again, guidance on physical contact for private teachers. I've set up the ISM guidance there. In the legal team, I have to say, we really wish there was no physical contact, even when teaching. You know, it's up to you, but the risks for you as teachers are so high, you really need to think very carefully about whether you can find alternative ways of teaching. Room and transport arrangements, we've heard about room and transport arrangements. The only one I think we didn't talk about was journeys. And we've got there, don't take a child alone in a car on a journey, no matter how short, unless you've got written consent of the parent or the guardian, and even then in exceptional circumstances. So I then have gone to my last slide. Yeah, key takeaway points. Well, there we are. Key takeaway points are, here we are. Get in touch with the ISM legal team if you are in this situation. It is a desperately stressful situation to find yourself in, but it can be managed with support, and that, you know, we are here. But also make sure you are familiar with the ISM codes. There's the contact details as well. They're on the website. So there's a little bit of time left for questions, I think. That's me finished.
Thanks so much, Nerys.
That's all right.
Yes, so as you said, we have got a bit of time for some questions. So we've had some pre-submitted ones, and we also have had one submitted live. So we'll go through what we can now. But Jonathan, as well, if you, oh yes, you jumped back on with us. Great, thank you. So the first one is, what is your take on the use of CCTV in teaching rooms? So I don't know, Jonathan, if you want to start, or Nerys.
I can pop in. I mean, my feeling is that if these things, CCTV can actually be very useful as long as it's not audio, as long as it's just cameras. But it's got to be done with people's consent and buy-in, so that VMTs understand, that it's coming and why it's coming. And then it's often when these things are imposed, that's when you have the difficulties. But you are on your own in that room with a child. It's your word against theirs, and there's something to be said for it, I think. What do you think, Jonathan?
Well, I agree absolutely with what you say, Nerys. I couldn't have put it better myself. I think for most for most instrumental teachers, CCTV is or can be liberating, especially when it's video only, because it provides a sort of an objective record of what's been going on if there's to be an allegation. And so many of my clients have received false allegations, and we've sort of longed for some sort of CCTV record that could have disproved it, but it's not straightforward. And as Nerys says, I agree that it shouldn't be imposed, but it may be the least worst way of safeguarding you as a teacher in a school environment.
Thank you. Yeah, so going on to the live question that we've had, I don't know if either of you've got any kind of ideas for this, but they've asked, where can we get annual safeguarding training? If our school we're working with doesn't offer it, where can they access training? Do you have any suggestions of places?
Well, I mean, I would say as a first point that if you're teaching in a school, your school really should be offering annual safeguarding training to you,
Absolutely.
and there may be a kind of complexity given your status as a VMT, perhaps, and the school might be reluctant to pay you to attend that training. That's a frequent problem. The number of times I've gone into schools and I've been told in advance with a sort of nod and a wink that the music teachers are the problem, and I turn up and do an inset day and I say, so how many here are music teachers? And there's no one there, of course, because they're all peripatetic teachers who haven't been paid or even asked to attend. So I think the first answer is the school should provide it. There isn't, however, any harm in seeking out your own safeguarding training, both for your own development, but also perhaps for your own security. And there are organisations like the NSPCC which deliver that. Educare, which I think used to be part of TES, provide safeguarding training, and I think they do a safeguarding for music teachers module, which I think at one stage may have been developed with the involvement of some relevant professional bodies. I can't really remember the detail, but I have a vague recollection of that. And there are a whole load of cheap online introductory safeguarding courses, which can be helpful. I have a friend, an oboist, who has an involvement with a national society, and he has done online level 3 safeguarding, it's called, which is the safeguarding that safeguarding leads are required to do. And although it's not necessarily what you need, it can be very helpful in giving you an insight into some of the issues that those involved in safeguarding schools might need to have.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding on keeping children safe is that there's actually a statutory obligation, isn't there, on all teachers, on all schools, to ensure that teacher safeguarding is kept up to date annually. And that is interpreted usually by schools as an annual obligation to provide safeguarding training, not to pay for it necessarily, as in not to pay your self-employed VMTs to attend, but definitely they should be offering it. Another good source, but obviously only if it fits with the rest of your musical life, is the Church of England actually has a lot of really good safeguarding training. They've got a whole safeguarding portal with different leadership levels, which is more about, you know, enhancing your own understanding and also making yourself, you know, more attractive as a teacher going forward, because it's all skill setting, isn't it? It's all growing yourself as a person with, you know, lots of different skills and abilities.
Yeah, thank you. So the next question we've had is, so someone has asked, they currently leave their mobile phone in the car when teaching. Am I being overcautious?
What do you think, Jonathan? Do you want to take that one?
Yes. It is my answer, I think. I don't think it's necessary to do that at all. I agree, of course, that you shouldn't be using your mobile phone to video or record your lesson, except in very limited circumstances where consent has been given. And it's certainly not appropriate to use your mobile phone to have contact with a pupil in most circumstances. But I can't imagine why it might be necessary to leave it in the car. And I think that's probably caution bordering on unnecessarily cautious behaviour, really.
I think that's right. I mean, I've certainly been into schools representing VMTs where you have to either give up your mobile phone or commit to have it switched off while you're in the school. And so, you know, a school is welcome to have its own policies in relation to mobile phones, but if they haven't got one, then I think absolutely it's overcautious.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And so, Nerys, I don't know if you want to take this one first, but we've had more and more VMTs are being expected to work on a self-employed basis in schools, especially as a response to the addition of VAT of independent school fees. Are there any concerns linked to this development in the context of safeguarding?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, isn't it? I mean, it is something that concerns me actually, because the truth is that all teachers are covered by keeping children safe in education. But the reality is that if you're not an employee, then you don't have the protection in an employment tribunal from unfair dismissal if you're treated unfairly. I mean, that's the first point. So although there's a statutory obligation to treat you fairly and follow a fair procedure, you can't actually go and enforce it anywhere because you're not employed. That's one point that's quite concerning, very concerning. Another point, as I loosely mentioned this as I'm going through, you know, if you face a safeguarding allegation as a self-employed person, you will be notionally suspended. What I mean by that is you will not be allowed to work anymore, but you won't be getting paid. And worse than that, if you're self-employed in a variety of schools, and this has a knock-on effect on all the other schools where you work, you can find yourself not getting paid anywhere. So I think it's going to have quite a serious impact. I think it's one of the reasons. I mean, for me, actually, it's one of the reasons why we thought this training was a particularly good idea at this time, because right now so many VMTs are finding themselves in this situation of being expected, you know, to shift from employment to self-employment. Has all kinds of problems, you know, arising out of that. But this is one problem which I think is particularly concerning, and self-employed VMTs or people who have not been self-employed before need to really pay attention to making sure that they don't do any of this problematic behavior, because of the incredibly precarious position they will be in financially and in terms of the loss of their employment protections going forward if something happens.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. Do you have anything to add to that, or is that kind of covered?
I agree completely. I do think that moving towards a self-employed model for visiting music teachers also can deprive you of access to systems which may be helpful, and access to training which may be helpful too. So I agree with everything Nerys said, and that would have been my primary answer. But it's also worth contending for access to school emails and access to Teams or whatever it might be, so that you can then play a full proper part in reporting any safeguarding concerns that might arise.
That's absolutely right. And there's a lot of negotiating going on at the moment in different schools to make sure that the arrangements that are in place for these self-employed VMTs provide those sorts of access for these very reasons. I mean, there's all sorts of things like, for example, are you going to have information about your pupil? Are you going to be told, for example, if they have some kind of special educational need? Will you know that? You know, will you know about a disability? It's the scheme of things is simply not the same as it has been in an employed setting. So I agree with you.
You. So I think we are pretty much out of time there. So thank you both so much for that extremely useful session. And thank you to everyone for joining us. I hope that you all found it useful and informative. And if you have any further questions, please do email us on membership@ism.org and we can always pass it to the legal team. The webinar recording will be sent to you by email along with some information about the ISM and how you can join if you're not already a member. And please do fill in our post-webinar survey. You can find it in the chat and it will also be emailed out to you with the recording. We really appreciate your feedback. Our next webinars are going to be hosted by the ISM Trust on applying the revised music curriculum documents taking place on the 16th and the 23rd of June. So finally, may I thank you again for watching and we hope to see you at another ISM event soon. Goodbye.